Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's November 30, 2021, and this is episode 761. Last Friday I spent a few hours in the Jindai Botanical Park, my local park, and the reason that I moved to Chofu in Tokyo 11 years ago. I took a gimbal that I used to steady my Canon EOS R5 and a new 7-inch monitor that I've bought for it, partly to test my setup, but I also have wanted to provide some video footage of the autumn leaves for some time now, so I made my visit into a little project to make a video, basically taking you along with me for a stroll in the park. I edited the video relatively quickly after getting home on Friday, and then on Sunday, with a rough idea of what I wanted to do for the music, I spent a few hours creating what I think is a relatively relaxing piano track that I timed to perfectly match the length of the video. I also set the tempo to a relatively steady pace, as I wanted it to complement just walking through the park. I've put the video in the top of the blog post. If you already support this podcast on Patreon, then you'll be able to see all of the text and images in a full post. If you are not a Patreon supporter, then you'll still be able to listen and follow along with the images and the video via the same link. And that link is mbp.ac/761. I do hope you enjoy the video, but we're also going to continue now and talk about the shoot and some of the images that I came back with that I should have shot alongside the video. So there are two images to begin with that show you the gear that I took with me. In the first photo, it's out on the table in the studio as I prepared and then packed into my bag. I also attached my tripod to the bag before we left, and as you can see, the gimbal doesn't really fit into my current bag. So I'm currently thinking of options that will better suit this type of gear, but for the purposes of this little project, I was fine with just dropping the gimbal into my large vest pocket when not in use. The Jindai Botanical Park has a number of car parks nearby, and I select which one I use based on what I want to do. The large car park near the main entrance is generally fine, but as you pay by the hour, it can turn out quite pricey. We were in the park for just under 3 hours, and the car park cost $8 or 800 yen. If we want to have a walk through the little group of shops or visit the water garden at the other end of the park, there are some private car parks that charge 800 yen for a whole day. So if I know I'm going to be in the park for more than 3 hours, I generally park in a private car park near the Jindai temple. On this day though, we parked near the main entrance and walked through to the pond, where there's a little pagoda that my wife and I generally visit first when we go to the park and enter through the main gate. I sat at one of the benches there and set up my gimbal, so that's where the video starts. I then shot some footage as we walked through the park along the brook that fills the pond and across the little quaint stepping stones that I included in the video. Then on through one of the main rest areas and over to the maple trees that turn yellow and red at this time of year. I didn't use what I call the rolling legs technique to steady the video more than the gimbal would already do for two reasons. The main one being that I didn't want to look like an idiot while on a walk in the park with my wife. If I was on a professional job, I would have bent my legs and walked as steadily as possible. But it wasn't a professional job, it was a walk in the park. And the second reason is that I really just wanted the video to feel like you were strolling along beside me. And as you'll see, The gimbal does a great job of steadying the center of the frame, so you don't really feel nauseous as you watch, but the edges of the frame move with my footsteps, so you can see that we're walking. I edited the footage to a number of clips that lead us through the park and then walk through the maple trees while filming to give you a feel for the atmosphere. I love this area of the park and don't think I've ever visited in any season without walking through there, and I think the video helps you to understand why. Once I get to the end of the path, I turn around and come back to the center, but then I packed away the gimbal and spent another hour or so shooting stills and video with my 100 to 500mm lens, mostly zoomed in all the way to 500mm. All of the footage while walking through the park was shot at around 35mm, and I zoomed out to 24mm while walking through the maple trees to show you more of the colourful canopy. We'll walk through a number of stills that I shot now, and if you watch the video you'll notice that most of them are the same framing as the clips shot from various positions along the maple tree path. In this first shot we see some of the yellow maple leaves, but can also see some patches of orange, which I've not noticed in the past. I wondered if conditions this year would give rise to some hybrid colours, if that's possible, so I'm going to try to go back in a week or so before these leaves fall, if only to check. At 500mm with this lens, my widest aperture is f7.1, and that was what I shot all of today's images at, so I won't keep repeating this. There are also only 2 that were not shot at 500mm, so I won't repeat that either. I did most of my exposure manipulation with the ISO and shutter speed, and this image was shot at a 400th of a second at ISO 400. Once I've found some leaves that appeal to me, I start to look at their background and see if there is an angle that I can shoot from that gives a pleasing background. When Canon first announced the RF 100 to 500mm lens, there was the usual spate of complaints that you'll see online, and one of the main ones was that the aperture of 500mm was too small at f7.1. But as you can see from this and the rest of the images today, at 500mm, f7.1 provides plenty of smooth bokeh, both in the background and the foreground. Complaining about this aperture shows nothing more than a lack of understanding of depth of field. This next image is a contrast from what I usually shoot. These leaves were in the shadows beneath some brightly lit leaves, but I really like how they fell into almost complete darkness and showed only the silhouettes against the patches of lighter bokeh in the background. This sort of shot is one of the few times that I don't use my usual expose to the right technique. I could have exposed to the right and then darkened this down, but it's not necessary to get good image quality. I dropped my ISO to 160 for this at a 200th of a second. I used the same ISO and shutter speed of 160th of a second for this next shot, where the orange leaves were getting a lick of light, and you can see the darker leaves from the previous shot just poking into the bottom of the frame here. You'll notice in the video that the contrast between the shadow areas and the spots that get lit through gaps in the canopy can be quite great, and this is one of the reasons that I like this spot. I like to work with extremes, as they provide creative opportunities. Without the shadows, the highlights wouldn't work in many of these images. The following image, though, is all about the contrast between the colours yellow and green. I sampled 10 of the key colours from this image automatically in an application called Spectrum that I use when I'm curious about the colours in an image, and I really like the palette from this image. We can also see in the second screenshot that all of the colours are neighbours in the colour wheel, and neighbouring colours are generally complementary, but there is enough contrast in the colours to separate the elements out. We're back to more of a light and dark contrast in this next image though, as I once again play with the shadows and highlights in these beautiful leaves and their backgrounds. Notice too that I have positioned the batch of leaves just to the left of centre over a dark area of the background to give them the separation required to appreciate their form. This image was one of the two that I pulled back from 500 to 428mm to get the framing that I wanted. With my shutter speed at 160th of a second, I also increased my ISO to 640 for this exposure. I have to admit though, and long-time listeners may also recall, that I do have a soft spot for the yellow leaves that we see in this following image, especially with the dark background. I've enjoyed shooting this kind of image at this location for probably around 15 years now, even when I lived in the centre of Tokyo and sometimes drove out here to Chofu to visit this park. I also pulled back a little for this photo to 451mm. I dropped my ISO to 100 for this with a shutter speed of a 250th of a second. Between all of these shots I was, of course, switching into video mode and left my little Rode mic on the top of the camera the whole time so that I could capture the ambient sounds. There is also one point in the video where you hear a large temple bell, which I believe rang out at noon. I always find the sound of these big bells very soothing, so I'm happy to have included that in the video. Next we see some of the deep red leaves that are at the start of the path through the maple trees. Again, I enjoy the contrast between the dark patches in the background and the out of focus other red leaves. We're back at 500mm for this and the rest of the images, and my ISO was at 250 and my shutter speed was also a 250th of a second. The following image may well have worked better towards the end of the video, but I do like the light and dark areas of this image, with the dark tree trunk separating the two sides. You'll notice how in the video, with this and many of the cuts, I focused on a patch of leaves in the foreground before moving the focus out to the red leaves. I enjoy the out of focus areas of images and like to play with that when shooting video as well. I'm still focusing with the focus ring on the lens, mind. I haven't invested in a focusing setup for the gimbal, as I'm generally doing okay with this lens, although you'll probably notice that I did shake the camera a little a few times in the video. This final image is a reflection on the surface of the brook that runs through the park. For this I focused on the silhouetted maple leaves against the patch of red, but as you'll see in the closing scene of the video, there were many layers to this image as I focused through to eventually settle on the leaves sitting on the top of the water before fading to black for the ending credits. Since DSLR cameras became video aware, I've been shooting what I call moving stills, which are generally around 30-second clips framed like photos, but when you look closer, they're moving. There is one section in the video where the leaves are so still, if it wasn't for one leaf rotating on a thread of a spider's web, you'd probably think it was a still photograph, but everything in the video is video, with no stills. I'll put B&H links to the main gear used in the show notes for this episode, and we'll follow up soon with an episode dedicated to talking more about the Weebill S gimbal and supporting kit that I'm using with this. I also have a bit of information on what to avoid when buying a gimbal for the Canon EOS R5 and EOS R, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. All in all, it was a fun little project and I enjoyed the entire process and hope you enjoyed joining me for a stroll in the park. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon, which comes with various tiers of benefits depending on your contribution, although all tiers provide access to the full blog posts for more than 750 episodes, as well as access to the MVP community. For further details, check out our Patreon page at mbp.ac/Patreon. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.